and welcome to this session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. So in this session, Gabriel Bodar is going to talk about how to encode the edition metadata in EpiDoc. So please, Gabby, go ahead.
Thank you, Irene. By edition metadata, what we mean is the information about the publication, the sorts of things you would expect to find in a library catalog, say, for either the corpus or for the individual texts within your edition. And we'll talk about both of those in a moment. The sorts of things that we see in that category include the title of the individual inscription. So these are things relevant to the individual inscription, the title, the identifier that the inscription gets. So this might be, it might have a number in your corpus. Other identifiers that you know the inscription by, not every identifier that it's ever been known by in the past, because that's more of a bibliographic feature than a metadata for your edition. But there may be other identifiers that other people have given it that you use centrally in your project. Information about the author or authors, editors, and other contributors to the encoding of this edition. So both those who have contributed the intellectual content, those who have done encoding, which I think we've argued is also intellectual content, even if they wouldn't normally be named as authors in the edition. They need to be named somewhere. And the information about the corpus as a whole, the publication information, the availability, the license that it's released under. Many digital editions of this kind are released under Creative Commons and other open licenses, for example. But if it's not, you'll want to say what the licensing information is, even if it's all rights reserved copyright. And then information about keywords, which again is more relevant to individual inscriptions, but can also be there can also be keywords for a corpus as a whole. That can be useful to record. Your EpiDoc file, for reference, your EpiDoc file is both a part of your publication and it is potentially a freestanding object. So lots of information in your EpiDoc file is relevant specifically to your publication tool. So if you're publishing in FS, for example, you have links to your authority lists, you have things encoded in the way that your instance of FS is expecting to find, so that it knows how to index them, to put them in the search facets, to filter by them in other contexts, to visualize them. But your file will also potentially be freestanding if, as we strongly recommend, but obviously don't require, but we strongly recommend you make your published EpiDoc files also available as XML files. Then they may be taken by other people, and they may find themselves needing to be used outside of the context of your publication tool. So if you have a link to your authority file, someone with just the EpiDoc XML file won't have your authority file in front of them. So that link may not necessarily mean anything. So some of your encoding also needs to be aware of the possibility that it will be reused and discovered by others outside of your publication. It may be ingested by a larger corpus, such as one of the Eagle databases, or something similar. And then it may need to be processed by some more generic tool, not necessarily publication tools, but also tools that would transform your EpiDoc file into linked open data, for example, following either epigraphical papyrological practice, or other kinds of tools that would take your data and turn it into structured data of one kind or another. So just I mentioned this just to sort of have an eye to making your file still useful outside of the context of your publication tool. There may be some things you want to do slightly differently for that purpose. So most of what we're talking about is in this section at the top of your EpiDoc file. I've just given the first couple of sections. This is in the file description, which contains various information, but specifically in that there's the title, decital statement, and publication statement. And I'll talk first about the title statement, which is here. And so an example of a title statement is, here is an inscription. Its title is Dedication of Monument to Hermes and Heracles, and the editor is George Reynolds in this case. There can, of course, be multiple editors for a text, and that's as it should be. Most projects are collaborative, you may therefore want to give the individual editors identifiers. So this XML ID attribute is a unique identifier. So no other element in your document can have this same XML identifier, so that when I use a pointer to this identifier somewhere else in the document or somewhere else in the corpus, it can only refer to Joyce Reynolds. It can't refer to anything else. So, for example, in the translation, I might say, along with all the other things I say about the translation, I say resp equals, and then a pointer, that hatch character tells me that this is a pointer to an element in the same file. I mean, it points to the XML ID, which is CMR, which, as we recall from the previous slide, is the XML ID of Charlotte Ruchet. So this tells us that this translation was created by and encoded by Charlotte Ruchet in this example. The other thing you might want to do is give the editors roles. So both Joyce Reynolds and Charlotte Ruchet, in the case of this example, are editors in the normal epigraphic sense. They're editors of the corpus and editors of the individual text. But there are other people who might have the role of editor, who might have a slightly different, who might be tagged using the tag editor, which is slightly more generic than the term we normally use, that have a slightly different role. So my role, the role of certain Gabriel Bedard in the editing of this text, was not as the epigraphic editor in the case of this particular text, but with the technical editor of the project as a whole. So still has to be credited, but with a slightly different role. Also, people who you might not normally credit at all, and I think this is quite important, people who were involved in the encoding. So in this case, the Nancys were both interns who did some work encoding this corpus and lots of the texts in here. And in many projects, they would be forgotten, or they might be thanked, on a credits page if they're lucky. But here, I think it's really important to give those individual people credit in here. That they don't have to appear on the title page, although there's no reason why they shouldn't. But that's for you to decide. But if they appear in the text, in the XML file like this, they can also be given identifiers, and individual bits of work that they've done can therefore point to that editor in the way that we saw the translation pointing to Charlotte Ruchet earlier. So that I think is quite an important note, at the very least, to say that they've done some of the encoding. Okay, so they made decisions. I mean, as you've seen in previous presentations, in previous parts of these tutorials, the way you encode, apparatus content, the way you encode abbreviations sometimes adds richness that wasn't available in the handwritten draft of the inscription. And so these people have actually made decisions and made interpretations based on that. Again, some of these people might not normally be considered co-authors for that reason, but they should be credited in any case, or at least they can be credited if you want to do so. And I generally would argue that one should want to do so. So the second part of what we'll talk about is then the publication statement, which appears just below the title statement there. And in the case of this corpus, the same inscription that we used for the previous example, the publication, the corpus as a whole, is released under the authority of King's College London, because that's not exactly the publisher, but nevertheless it's the institution that released the content. And the identification number, the IDNO, of this inscription within the corpus is C647. And notice that this has a type of file name. IDNO is quite useful to give that a type. And file name is maybe slightly more technical than you'd want you to say, but in this case, it means this is the name of this. The primary name of this in this corpus, and it will in practice almost always be the file name as well that appears as part of the URL and so forth. But what's important is that any EpiDoc file, whether in this corpus or another, will have this IDNO type file name that tells you where to find this file within its current corpus. You may also in your project refer to this inscription by identification numbers that it has been given in other projects, such as in this case the Epigraphic Database Heidelberg and the Packet Humanities Institute inscriptions corpus. as I say, this is not a bibliographic reference per se. Not every previous identifier that this has been given belongs in the publication statement. That belongs somewhere else in the file, which will be discussed later in another tutorial. But if you use these identifiers in your corpus as part of your way of organizing your text, perhaps you used this before you assigned your final file names to them. You used the EDH numbers to make sure you had unique numbers for each one. Then these might be useful things for you to record in publication statement. Also, if you have a database which contains information about these inscriptions, you might also want to have an identification number from your database recorded in here, because that information may still be useful later if your database still exists in some other form. And the final thing I think I want to talk about here is just availability. We've said that we have the authority and the identification number, but availability tells you a little bit about under what terms this text and this document and this corpus have been released. And in this case, we're saying that it's been released under Creative Commons license. We might also give the URL of that license. We might describe that in some way, especially if if it's a non-standard license. There's all sorts of things you can put in there, but the simplest thing is simply to say license under availability, like that. All sorts of other things that you can say about this. You can mention the publisher. You can mention the publishing place. If the corpus has it, you can mention the distributor. If these things are all different and they're worth and they're the things you want to record. But the most important thing, regardless of whether or not you talk about the authority, the publisher, the distributor, and so forth, is to have this IDNO. IDNO type file name is very, very useful for, again, if your EpiDoc file ends up being used by someone outside of the context of your corpus. So then the third and final example that I want to talk about here is the tagging of keywords, or what might in some corpora be called category of text or type of document. And so here's an example from one corpus that has under text, there's various information, including category. And if you have a category of building inscription, this belongs in a part of the TI header called the profile description. This comes after the file description, which contains the title information that we just saw, which inside has text classification and keywords. And then in keywords, you can have one or more terms which give you that category of the text. Obviously, some text will have multiple categories. You might have some corpora where every single text in this corpus has a particular category. So this isn't necessarily something that you want to print in the edition of each one, but it's still worth recording in your XML file, because someone who takes this file on its own needs to be able to categorize this as a building inscription, even if you have a corpus only of building inscriptions. Okay, so it's still useful to encode this, whether or not you decide you want to display this in some way. Also worth noting that I've used the Eagle vocabulary here for building inscription here in the ref attribute to make this useful again for people outside of the context of my corpus, but within the context of my edition, especially if I'm wanting to produce my edition using FS, it's actually more useful for me to point to the identifier of the concept of building inscription, which might be doc5 in this case, in my XML file authority list of categories. And this is, and you might want to do both things, but this is the one which will enable me to index it within my corpus. And the Eagle URL is the one that will be useful to people wanting to look at this as part of a larger corpus in a larger context. So both of those have different values at different stages in the process. As a final note, some of the things I've talked about in this tutorial are described in the EpiDoc guidelines, especially in the page on publication information. But actually, this page is a little bit deficient and could do with improvement in the long term. Just as a sort of heads up. And I say that in March 2021. It may be that if you're watching this video in a later month or a later year, that someone has in that time improved that page. So it is worth going and taking a look at it, as they may be useful information in there already. I think that's about it from me. Anything you think we should add to that, Irene?
No. It was perfect.
The only thing that occurred to me that you said to me earlier, actually, is that in this slide, in the past, several projects have used slightly different ways of encoding keywords and categories in their corpora, and there are still 3 that I know of ways of encoding this information in active projects that therefore have to be catered for by tools like FS and so forth. So you may see different ways of encoding this information, but if you're not beholden to one of those projects, we would strongly recommend that you use this canonical EpiDoc way of encoding the category of text for your corpus.
Right.
Great. Cool. Great. Thank you.